February 1st, 1942. It's been almost 2 months since the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor by Japanese forces. To the Japanese soldiers and sailors manning their posts on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, the Americans have practically been knocked out of the fight in the first round. Nobody expected any less. The Americans are soft. They have no stomach for war. A few thousand feet above their heads, the Japanese begin to hear the sound of approaching thunder through the clouds. Sudden panic grips them as they realize that's no thunder. It's the roar of dozens of American Devastator torpedo bombers and Dauntless dive bombers, launching from the decks of the USS Yorktown and the USS Enterprise. America's war against the Japanese Imperial forces has officially begun. Accompanying each of the two carriers are cruisers and destroyers who open up on shore facilities with their guns. Planes from the Yorktown and Enterprise bomb Japanese positions and strafe Japanese planes caught on the ground. By the end of the day, 3 warships will be sunk, with several others damaged, and 18 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground or shot out of the sky. The Americans will lose 14 aircraft and suffer heavy damage to 1 cruiser. But though it's minor, the day ends in victory for the Americans and shock to the Japanese. The American Navy was supposed to take years to recover from Pearl Harbor, not months. The USS Enterprise, affectionately known by her crew as the Big E, steams back toward Pearl Harbor and en route is assigned to lead the newly formed Task Force 16. None of the thousands of sailors know it yet, but as the convoy of cruisers, destroyers, and the USS Enterprise steam off into the West Pacific, they're sailing into the pages of naval history. The task force steams for Wake Island. The island was lost shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, despite the heroic defense put up by the tiny Marine garrison and naval aviators. Unable to match the Japanese surface fleet's might, a relief task force steaming for the island had been recalled at the last minute, and now the U.S. denies the Japanese Navy use of the island by establishing a submarine blockade. The Japanese on the island are now on starvation rations, relief unable to reach them. The Enterprise will make sure that the Japanese on Wake Island remain isolated, and its aircraft strafe and bomb the Japanese garrison, putting its airfield out of commission. To ensure that the Japanese are unable to repair the airfield, the island will be periodically attacked by passing ships. With the U.S. Navy still rebuilding, the Big E can't afford to get into a showdown with the main Japanese fleet. But she will help ensure that Japan feels the sting of war, just like the American soldiers, sailors, Marines, and civilians on Pearl Harbor did. Joining with the USS Hornet, the Enterprise sails deep into hostile waters until it's only 650 miles from the Japanese mainland. The task force has sailed in complete radio silence. The mission so top secret, only a handful of military and government personnel are aware of the task force's location. Fighters from the Enterprise have been screening the convoy's movement the entire time, wary of being discovered and attacked by the Japanese. But the strict secrecy has kept the small fleet safe from prying eyes. Aboard the Hornet, U.S. Army B-25 medium bombers roar to life. These planes have been specifically modified to be as light as possible, stripping away most of their defensive armaments and reinforcing armor. Nobody has ever launched such a massive plane from an aircraft carrier, but the big bombers are the only plane the U.S. has that can reach their intended target, Tokyo, Japan. America is striking back, right at the beating heart of the Japanese Empire. The big planes lurch forward one by one, barely reaching takeoff speed before running out of deck. The first B-25, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, lifts up into the air. With a cheer from the assembled sailors, the rest of the planes lift off. Hours later, the planes drop high explosive and incendiary bombs over their assigned targets in and around Tokyo. The surprised Japanese barely manage to get more than a handful of fighters into the air, of which 3 will be shot down, with the loss of no American aircraft. Though the raid caused little more than superficial damage to the Japanese forces, it shook Japanese civilians' confidence in the ability of its military leadership to protect the home islands from attack. Even more importantly, it caused morale to soar back home, rallying Americans back from the crushing defeat at Pearl Harbor. But the Big E was done playing escort or picking fights with small Japanese outposts. It was time to go toe-to-toe with the best Japan had to offer. American intelligence had just uncovered Japanese plans to invade and take Midway Island. Led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japanese forces needed to draw American carriers into an all-out fight and end their threat once and for all. While strategically unimportant to the Japanese, Midway Island was properly assessed by Yamamoto of being of crucial strategic importance to the Americans. Without its airfield and naval facilities, the U.S. Navy would be hard-pressed to launch combat operations deep into the Western Pacific. Yamamoto's plan was simple: attack Midway and lure out the 2 surviving American carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet. With the island just outside of the range of American air forces in Pearl Harbor, if the U.S. wanted to hold it, it would have to commit its remaining aircraft carriers. With the Lexington and Yorktown struck down at the Battle of Coral Sea, Mopping up what was left of American resistance in the Pacific should be a piece of cake. The Americans were aware of the key components of Yamamoto's plans and rushed to put together a force capable of fighting off up to 5 carriers. Unknown to the Japanese, the Yorktown had in fact not been sunk, though needed an estimated several months of repairs to be battle-worthy again. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz gave the repair crews 3 days, and in an incredible feat of human endurance, the crews restored the Yorktown to battle-capable state within the allotted time, with further repairs continuing even as she steamed toward Midway. The USS Hornet, a still badly damaged Yorktown, and a force of 7 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 15 destroyers, 16 submarines, and 127 aircraft stationed on Midway Island itself, would be led into the teeth of the Japanese Navy by the Enterprise herself. Opposing the American defenders was a force of 4 carriers, 2 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 14 destroyers, with a reinforcing fleet just a few days behind the main fleet, consisting of 2 light carriers, 5 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, and 2 light cruisers. The Battle of Midway would be America's own Thermopylae, and despite the odds, the Big E was itching for a proper stand-up fight at last. At 9 a.m. on the 3rd of June, a sole American patrol aircraft spots the Japanese occupation force, mistaking it for the main force. 9 B-17s are immediately dispatched to attack the Japanese ships, but run into a transport group instead and decide to attack. They are immediately met by heavy enemy anti-aircraft fire, severely degrading the accuracy of the American bombers. Despite several bombing runs, not a single Japanese ship is hit, and the American planes limp back to base, an auspicious start to the American defense of Midway. At 4:30 a.m. the next day, a force of over 100 Japanese planes lumbers toward Midway. They're spotted an hour later by American patrol aircraft, who also managed to spot the location of 2 of the Japanese carriers. The Americans have to make a very difficult choice. They have an opportunity to attack the Japanese carriers and potentially cripple the Japanese Navy, but to do so, their bombers will have to fly unescorted, as the escort fighters are desperately needed to defend the island itself. A choice is made, and the American bombers take to the sky without their escorts. By 6 a.m., the battle for Midway has officially begun. Japanese planes tear through the sky, their escort fighters met in the air by 6 American F-4Fs and 20 F-2As. The F-2As are all but obsolete as they engage in battle with modern Japanese Zeros, which at the time are the most advanced fighter in the world. In mere minutes, 15 of the American planes have been downed, though they've managed to down 5 of their own. The Japanese bomb the airfields, hangars, and defensive fortifications, but while the American fighters are getting knocked out of the sky, U.S. anti-aircraft gunners are deadly accurate, forcing many Japanese aviators to miss their targets. The attack is forced to break off, and the returning pilots radio the rest of the fleet that at least one more air attack would be necessary to prepare Midway for invasion. As the Japanese attack is returning, the American attack on the Japanese carriers is in full force. 52 American dive bombers and torpedo planes descend on the Japanese forces, but are met by the carrier group's combat air patrol. A fierce battle ensues in the sky above the carriers, with the Japanese inflicting terrible losses on the Americans. One American B-26, seriously damaged by anti-aircraft fire and possibly out of control, aims straight for the bridge of the Akagi, where Admiral Nagumo is leading his battle group. At the last moment, though, the plane cartwheels out of control and crashes into the ocean harmlessly. No Japanese vessel suffers more than superficial damage. Things are not going well for the already vastly outnumbered Americans. While under attack, Japanese Admiral Nagumo receives a contact report from a scout plane searching for the U.S. fleet. The plane, however, is unable to determine the size or exact composition of the fleet, and Nagumo orders the plane to approach at all risk and determine if the American carriers are present. He's under orders to make the destruction of the surviving American carriers his top priority, after which mopping up any defense on Midway or the rest of the Pacific was simply a matter of time. As the scout plane struggles to determine if the American carriers are present, completely unbeknownst to the Japanese was the fact that the American carriers had already launched their own attacks, spearheaded by torpedo and dive bombers from the USS Enterprise. The Americans operate under radically different doctrines than the Japanese and are operating on the gamble that the Japanese carriers would be caught trying to recover planes from the attack on Midway, making them critically vulnerable. While Japanese doctrine states that planes are to be held in reserve until an attack can be fully constituted, the Americans decide that it's more important to keep the Japanese occupied and thus hamper a counterattack. Thus, they launch their fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes piecemeal, each small attack element flying into the enemy as fast as possible. It'll mean higher casualties, and it's a massive gamble that U.S. aviators will pay for dearly. Dive bombers from the Hornet mistake the enemy contact report and fly at a heading of 265 degrees rather than 240 degrees reported by the scout plane, completely missing the Japanese forces. Disagreeing over the heading, the group's torpedo bombers break off and head on the correct heading. The strike had been launched at the very edge of the plane's maximum ranges though, and 10 of the planes are forced to turn back and ditch, never reaching the target. American devastators, however, follow a correct heading and make contact with the Japanese fleet. Their fighters, however, had lost contact with their escort, ran low on fuel, and were forced to turn back to the Enterprise for refueling. This leaves the devastators without any air cover. But knowing that the Japanese carriers must be destroyed before they can in turn destroy the outnumbered American fleet, the devastators fly into the teeth of the fierce Japanese resistance to deliver their torpedoes. 20 minutes later, more torpedo attack aircraft from the Enterprise join in the action. Swift and agile Japanese Zeros pounce on the unescorted torpedo planes though, tearing through them with devastating consequences. Over half of the attacking force is shot out of the sky without a single hit on the enemy vessel. The Battle of Midway is very quickly turning into a losing proposition for American forces. However, one pilot's gamble would change the course of the war in the Pacific. Confusion has thrown 2 of the Enterprise's dive bomber squadrons way off course, and they're running low on fuel. Air Group Commander Captain Wade McCluskey Jr. faces a tough choice: continue the search or turn back to the Enterprise before his aircrew is forced to ditch their planes. War material is still in short supply after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and subsequent losses in the Coral Sea. The U.S. Navy could ill afford to be ditching perfectly good planes and potentially losing their crews as well. Despite these considerations, McCluskey decides to continue the search for the Japanese carriers. By sheer luck, McCluskey's air group spots the wake of the Japanese destroyer Arashi, which is steaming at full speed to rejoin the carriers after chasing off an American submarine earlier in the morning. Like a giant homing beacon, the aircraft follow the big ship's wake straight to the target, and suddenly fully laid out before and below them is the Japanese fleet. The Combat Air Patrol, which had just devastated the first American attack, inflicting horrendous losses, is out of position and low on fuel and ammo, chasing an attack wing from the Yorktown that had just arrived on target as well. On carriers Kaga and Akagi, Japanese aircraft from the Midway attack are being recovered and rearmed for the attack on the U.S. carriers. The decks are clogged with men, planes, bombs, and fuel, and overhead 3 American strike groups have just arrived from 3 different directions. It's time for payback. The Japanese put up a desperate screen of anti-aircraft fire, but with their Zeros miles away, the American planes are almost completely unopposed. An order is given for the attacking aircraft to split into 2 groups, one attacking the Kaga and the other the Akagi. However, a miscommunication leads to both groups descending on the Kaga, which is only corrected at the very last moment, with dive bombers pulling out of their attack run and retargeting the Akagi. The Kaga suffers multiple direct hits, the dive bomber's 500-pound bomb smashing into her deck. One of the bombs hits right in front of the bridge, instantly killing all of the Kaga's senior officers. Another rips open her flight deck, exposing the hangar below. Japanese machine gunners desperately try to fend off the attack, but to no avail, themselves gunned down by strafing American planes. The attack on the Akagi is less successful, with the torpedo planes and dive bombers only scoring glancing blows. However, one bomb manages to hit the midship elevator and penetrate through to the hangar below, which is full of aircraft and fuel. The explosion starts a fire that within hours engulfs the entire ship. At the same time the Enterprise's attack is exacting deadly revenge on the Akagi and Kaga, Yorktown's bombers strike at the Soryu. Several hits ignite huge stores of gasoline, setting off the same bombs and torpedoes being loaded onto Japanese planes meant to destroy the American carriers. In the span of an hour, Japan has just lost 3 of its largest aircraft carriers. Admiral Nagumo is found in a state of shock and forced to leave his sinking ship by aides. But the battle was not over, however. The lone Japanese carrier Hiru launches its own counterattack against the Americans. The Japanese aviators follow the returning American planes to the Yorktown and are immediately met by fierce anti-aircraft fire. The attack manages to score several direct hits on the Yorktown, blowing a hole in her deck and crippling the ship. However, within an hour, damage control parties are able to patch her up so efficiently that a second wave of Japanese aircraft actually believe the ship to be a brand new American carrier. The second attack brings the Yorktown to a standstill, severely crippling the ship. Despite heavy losses, the triumphant Japanese counterattack returns home to report that 2 American carriers have been sunk. With the belief that only the USS Hornet and Enterprise were operational, the news is a huge morale boost to the beleaguered Japanese sailors, who have just lost 3 of their own carriers. They'd be in for the shock of their life when hours later the all-too-familiar roar of American strike aircraft begins to fill the sky above them. Launching Zero fighters, Hiru puts up a fierce defense against the combined attack wave of Enterprise and Yorktown dive and torpedo bombers. The American aviators, however, fight through the Japanese defenders and screens of anti-aircraft fire and doggedly remain on target despite heavy fire. Several bombs rip through the Hiru, setting off fierce blazes that consume the ship. Her crew desperately tries to salvage the ship, but as the fire grows out of control, the crew is evacuated to a support ship. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi and Captain Tomeo Kaku choose to go down with the ship rather than face the dishonor of defeat. Expecting to rout American forces and destroy the US's remaining carriers in the span of 24 hours, the Japanese have lost 4 of their carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and thousands of their most experienced aviators. By comparison, the US lost only the Yorktown, which survived the Battle of Midway, only to be torpedoed by a Japanese sub on her way home for repairs. For the USS Enterprise, this would be but the first of many combat commendations that would eventually make her the most decorated ship of World War II. But the Big East War was far from over. Japanese carrier forces had been crippled, but its navy remained a formidable foe. After a month of well-earned rest and relaxation, the sailors and pilots of the Enterprise would set out to sea once more, this time to turn back yet another Japanese assault and continue her job of destroying the Japanese carrier force. Now check out How I Survived D-Day, or click this other video instead.